Hello, welcome back. I hope you are doing well. We are gonna do get started now on our first lecture of a series of lectures on the Christian traditions. So let's get started. I am going to share my screen with you here, and we'll get started into our first lecture on the Christian traditions. So we want to start with the origins, of course, and a little background on the geographical location from which the Christian tradition emerges. And then we're going to turn to the sacred text, that is the New Testament, a collection of 27 books that came together over the course of the first few centuries after the life of Jesus of Nazareth, and then became authoritative within the life of the early church. So we'll talk about origins in the New Testament over the course of the next two or possibly three lecture sessions. Here's an overview. So we're going to talk about the origins of the Christian traditions. We'll talk about some non-historical, non-Christian historical sources and how they shed some light on our understanding of Jesus of Nazareth. We will connect Jesus to the Jewish tradition, which he was a Jew, and Jesus's movement starts out as a Jewish movement before it transitions into a movement for all people, for Jews and non-Jews. And that largely happens through an early Christian missionary named Paul. And so we'll have a class largely focused on the Apostle Paul and his teachings because he's a major contributor to the early formation of this Christian movement, which originally was called the Way, and it was this Jewish tradition that eventually is going to, in some ways remain always connected to its Jewish roots, but in other ways expand expand beyond them and become a religion that's for all people and become a global religion. So that happens under Paul, the Apostle Paul. So we're gonna spend a lecture on the Apostle Paul, and then after the letters of Paul, there's at least seven of the writings that comprise the New Testament are letters from Paul. After Paul, you have a collection of writings from other authors who are writing to other communities, and these are the later writings of the New Testament. So we'll talk about those too. That could be probably in maybe the third of a series of three lectures that we'll be having, and we'll conclude by having a discussion on the book of Revelation. So that will take us through the origins and through an introduction to the New Testament. So let's get started. Let's get started. Um, so the birthplace of Christianity, as I mentioned, important to note, it begins as the Jewish movement. The Gospels, which we're going to talk about today, they're rooted in the promise of the Messiah. So many Jews, had this long-lasting hope that a Messiah would return in order to liberate the people from the oppression they were under, whether it be under the oppression of Greek political authorities, or in the case, or in the context of the life of Jesus, it was Roman political authorities who had control and had power over Palestine and had control over the Israelites. So there was this long-standing hope amongst Jews that the Messiah would come and liberate them, just like Moses delivered them from Egypt and brought them across the Red Sea to the Promised Land. There's this hope of the Messiah coming to restore political order and to bring liberation. Rather than a new religious movement, early Christianity located itself as a continuation of the promises of Abraham. So recall the covenant made with Abraham back in the book of Genesis. and how the Lord God promised that his descendants would be as multiple as the stars in the sky. That Abraham, the promise that was made to Abraham of the Hebrew Bible, the Christian tradition understands itself to be in direct line with that promise, a continuation of the promise, indeed, a fulfillment of that promise. So any accusations of novelty which were launched at the early Christians were avoided by claiming its Jewish roots. So the last thing you wanted to be in the first century when Christianity emerged was novel. If a religious movement was deemed novel, it would automatically be deemed, understood to be suspicious, not trustworthy. Because what is more trustworthy is that which is more ancient. In the first century way of thinking. And so Christianity, in order to be trustworthy, it needed to locate its roots in the deep past. And one way it does that is by claiming it is an extension of or a continuation of the Jewish tradition, the Jewish religion. So the birthplace of the Christianity, it's in Israel. It's in Palestine. It's Palestine. It starts as a Jewish movement, consciously so, self-consciously so, and we'll show that as we progress forward. All 27 books of the New Testament were all written in Koine Greek, and this is entirely due to the Hellenization of the late Roman Empire, beginning with the reign of Alexander the Great in the fourth century before the Common Era. And so you have the Greekization, if you will. You have Greek culture and Greek language kind of overtaking the Mediterranean world, and thus the people of Palestine, they read and wrote in Greek. It was the common language or the lingua franca. So in terms of the structure of the New Testament, 27 books. There's four books at the front of the New Testament, which are each called Gospels. So just four Gospels. And these Gospels, they can be understood to be theological biographies about Jesus of Nazareth. And so the four Gospel writers, according to the tradition, originally the earliest manuscripts didn't have the names of these Gospel writers, but relatively quickly, later copies of their manuscripts added the names. So assigned these names, which become part of the tradition. And so the names of the four gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in that order. Oh, right. And so you have the four gospels according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Gospel, in terms of its etymology, its root meaning, the word means good news. The "eu" in Greek is good, and "angelion" is where you get the word angel from. So a angel is one that brings news. So "eu angelion," good news. The gospel is good news. Within its historical context, gospel had it echoed the return of a king from battle. So when a king or a military commander returned from battle and returned victorious, as he came close to the city, a trumpet would blow and it would announce the return of the commander who's now victorious. And the blowing of the trumpet was called the blowing of the gospel. It was the blowing of the good news. And so that's how the word gospel was used in the first century. And so, here it kind of echoes that, right? The Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Luke, they are blowing through this, they're blowing out, right? They're blowing and announcing the good news of Jesus of Nazareth. The Gospels, in terms of genre, they may fit the genre of a um, late ancient Roman biography, where the character of the protagonist, the character of the hero, is often revealed by the manner in which they die. And so, with each of the gospel stories, the majority of the time within each of them is spent on the last week of the life of Jesus, which is known as the Passion of Jesus. So, his trial, his arrest, his trial, and then his crucifixion and death onto his resurrection. The vast majority of each of these gospels focuses on that last week because that's the most theologically significant moment within the life of Jesus. Three of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're known as synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic means seen together, seen together. And they're called synoptic Gospels because these three Gospels share a lot of the same material, word for word in the Greek. So it's clear that these three Gospels are borrowing from the same source, are two of the Gospels are borrowing from an earlier source. Most scholars believe that Matthew and Luke borrow a significant amount of their material from the Gospel according to Mark, which is generally by most scholars dated earliest, and then they add other oral traditions and other material around, right, and in conversation with the material they borrowed from Mark. And so you see, if you look at the gospel according to Matthew, 80% of Mark is reproduced in the gospel according to Matthew, and 65% of Mark is reproduced in the gospel according to Luke. Now, the gospel according to John is largely understood and recognized by the vast majority of New Testament scholars to be the latest of the Gospels. It was written the latest, maybe about 90 Common Era, and it contains a lot of unique material in terms of what it offers us, in terms of understanding, and especially gaining a theological understanding of Jesus of Nazareth. So those are the four Gospels in total. I want to wrap it up just talking a little bit about Jesus of Nazareth, and then we'll continue the conversation on to our next lecture. Jesus of Nazareth, he was born in Bethlehem in Palestine. He was a Jewish teacher and a miracle worker. Most of the information we know about Jesus comes straight out of these four Gospels, which we just briefly discussed. Within the Gospels, they focus on the teachings of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus, the miracles of Jesus, and the death of Jesus. And there's a lot of focus on interpreting the significance of the death of Jesus. Jesus was crucified under the authority of the Romans. And so Jesus, being a Jew in the first century, he lived during a time when the Jewish people didn't have their independence, but rather they were under the political control of the Roman Empire. Jesus was called by many titles throughout the Gospels, which echo this expectation of the long expected Messiah. The Messiah, which means the anointed one. The Messiah is suggests this king who's going to return and is going to subvert and challenge and overthrow the Roman authorities. So titles such as Lord are applied to Jesus, and Son of God is applied to Jesus, and the title Son of Man is applied to Jesus. The title Lord, which in Greek is Kyrios, and the title Son of God, Urios to Theo in Greek. Both of those titles are titles that were frequently used to name the Roman emperor, because it was a Roman emperor who was to be called Lord, and it was a Roman emperor who was believed to be the Son of God. And by being the Son of God, the Roman emperor was believed to have authority and insight and have this connection with God, which affirmed their political power and position. So to call Jesus the Lord, to call Jesus the Son of God, was in fact a way to challenge the political authority of the emperor. So I think we're going to leave it there, and we'll pick it up next class. I'm talking more about Jesus, pressing on, making our way towards the Apostle Paul and his 7 letters, which are a significant part of the New Testament. All right, thank you so much. It's good to be with you, and we will pick it up next class. All right, take care.